good afternoon, everybody. I think Mike's introduction just means that I'm old. I had a lot darker hair and longer hair when I started with the agency some 35 plus years ago. Carol, thank you. Mike, thanks for the invitation. And thank you all for being here today. I've got a couple of slides that I'm going to go through to give some background and information, and then I really want to open it up for your questions because what the questions that you ask will inform us on what we need to do as an agency to better prepare communities and also address some of the concerns that you have about federal aid. So if that's good with you, also I want to say thanks to the nurses. I have a daughter who's an emergency room nurse in Fort Worth, Texas, and I certainly know the sacrifices that she makes each and every day to make sure that patients are taken care of. So thank you all very much for the work that you do. And I hope there was no correlation between the spilt milk and FEMA. All right, let's see. Okay. Here's our FEMA regional structure. And so we have 10 FEMA regions across the country that really work day in and day out with our state emergency management organizations. Each state has an emergency management organization. And then in 2012, legislation added that we had a nation-to-nation relationship with federally recognized tribal nations, and so regions that have federally recognized tribes now also work with those tribal nations. In Region 6, we have 68 tribal nations, most of those located in New Mexico and Oklahoma. And what's unique about that is the tribal nations in our regions are not reservations. They have trust lands that are really checkerboarded in with the local community. So in a block of 12 people, 5 of them could be tribal members, 7 non-tribal members, but they work very closely together, and we have a great relationship with our tribal nations, and they're building some great capability. At FEMA Region 6, our main office is located in Denton, Texas. That's where our headquarters is located, and we have offices in Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Houston, Austin, and we just opened an office in Santa Fe in response to some of the state's most significant wildfires that they had 2 years ago. And so I bring that up to you because we've employed a lot of people that have suffered damages here in Louisiana, and they have brought great resources to us in helping us inform some of our policy decisions, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But it also has us so that within hours of a governor's request, we can have people here working hand in hand with our state partners and some of the local parish officials to be able to respond and recover from disasters. FEMA is not the only entity that works disasters. We've got structures at local governments, state governments that work for parish officials, work for the governor, and then you've got the federal emergency management that works for the president. But you are part of that cycle as well. And so one of the things that hopefully we can have some conversation today is, what are you doing to be prepared? And I share a story. Back in 2014, I went to a tornado in Valonia, Arkansas, very small little rural community. And there was a story about a 4-year-old child who was rescued, and the news showed how were you rescued? Was it police? Was it fire? Was it a paramedic? And it was a flooring contractor. He was their next door neighbor. He heard their cries for help. He knew his family was safe. He had built a safe room in his home, and so when he heard the cries of his neighbors, he went, put the young lady in his pickup, and took her to the hospital where she made a full recovery. So I say that today because that individual was prepared, and in most cases, it's going to be your neighbor in a catastrophic event who's going to be able to give you that first aid that you may need. And so what can we do as citizenry to prepare so we make sure that we're taking care of the most vulnerable with the resources that we have limited at the federal, state, and local government level? And so we'll talk about a few of those things you can do. We have some resources available. We're really reaching out to the K through 12 community to be able to get our children involved, because we find if children take home to mom and dad, what are we doing about disasters, then that typically gets mom and dad to take a little bit of action. So we've got some templates and things out there that we certainly would encourage you all to look at and share with your communities. The other piece I'm going to talk about is the faith-based communities. And we find our faith-based communities do a great job in preparing, providing services, and we cannot do it without them. So in a disaster, while FEMA is a coordinator, we are not the end-all be-all. We don't have control over a situation. That's still through our Constitution at the parish and governor level. We are there in a support mechanism along with volunteer agencies and community-based organizations as well. And so if you're not involved in a community-based organization, if you're part of one who hasn't talked about preparedness and how you can help, certainly would encourage you to be part of our team. because the whole community is really what it takes to respond to a large-scale disaster. Last Sunday, I went up to a small community, Sulphur, Oklahoma, that their downtown business district was completely devastated. I don't think there, out of 40 to 50 businesses, there was one business that remained standing. And about 40 people were trapped in a restaurant, nightclub for several hours in that facility. But what I saw was communities from all around came to help. Their search and rescue teams, their fire, their police, their emergency medicine. Doctors came from all around to be able to help the one local hospital in the area that was receiving all the injured. And so it really does take a whole community. And so as we look at this cycle of going from preparedness to response to recovery to mitigation, we're always in some phase of that in some community. And preparedness should always be something that we're looking at doing day to day. And so this year, our administrators tabbed the Year of Resilience. And what does that mean? I mean, it means different things to different communities and individuals. One is, are you personally prepared? Do you have a plan? Do you know what to do if a disaster hits? What are the high risk in your area? Do you know, is it a tornado? Is it a flood? Is it a hurricane? Is it all of the above? Because in Louisiana, we know it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you're going to have some type of incident. I think just a year ago was the first time we really saw significant wildfires here in Louisiana. We've seen those in some of our western states, but really now we're seeing threats and hazards expanding. How many are familiar with the saltwater inundation that was occurring down south and really had the impact to move up north for communities that were pulling water from the river? Something that we'd experience maybe every 10 years, but not to the extent that we thought we were going to experience last year. Working with the Corps of Engineers, did some really creative engineering work on a saltwater seal that was built, but we really have to start looking at how do we address things like our aging infrastructure, our water systems, because once again, they're keys to our communities rebuilding. And so in our Year of Resilience, we're sharing best practices. We've got some additional grant funding that we're making available to state, local, and tribal governments to be able to help them build stronger, look at areas where we can mitigate some of that existing infrastructure. All right. In Louisiana, we always have activity. That's why we have an office here. We've got 17 open disaster declarations. So what does that mean? That means where we've got grant dollars that have been allocated to the state or local parish governments, some of the independent school districts, some other nonprofits that do governmental type services. We get asked a lot, why does it take so long? And we'll talk just a little bit. Some of our programs are reimbursement in nature. So that means the work has to be done, and then we provide reimbursement for the work that's eligible under the federal programs. We're working with the state to be able to advance more money because we know cash flow in today's economy may be difficult for some of our applicants, and so the state can advance the money, and then we work on reimbursing the state on those advancements. We have a couple different types of presidential disaster declarations. One is a major disaster declaration. That's where we bring in the full suite of federal programs and federal government agency resources. And so it's not just grant dollars, but the Department of Defense can bring in resources. The Corps of Engineers does the Blue Roof program. Many of you have seen the blue roofs around the state. If you fly in from anywhere, you'll see many blue roofs that are still out there. The Department of Health and Human Services brings in mobile hospitals, brings in disaster medical teams. And so, once again, FEMA is a coordinator to bring all of those to the table, working with our state and local partners. And we've done significant work in Louisiana on planning, especially around hurricanes, for general population evacuation, medical evacuations, things that we never hope that we have to use, but we have to have a plan because hope is not a plan in a disaster. Just a couple of pieces of information on disasters, and I'll talk some of the streamlining we've done from information that we've learned from Louisiana. But in Hurricane Ida, the most recent hurricane disaster we've had here, we've had more than $1.2 billion that went to the hands of survivors in Louisiana that suffered damages from Hurricane Ida. That is in addition to insurance money. And so one of the things we get asked about a lot about in FEMA is, I didn't get as much money as I thought I was going to get. By our legal authorities, we cannot duplicate what the insurance industry does. And so insurance is obviously going to be your best form of recovery. FEMA's programs are really set up as augmenting that to be able to get you to a safe and secure environment so that insurance, voluntary agencies, and others could take over. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. But in that storm alone, we put out over $1.2 billion in the hands of individuals, either homeowners or renters, who had suffered damages. And our public assistance program, which provides funding for infrastructure like schools, water systems, publicly owned hospitals, we put out about $2.4 billion in public assistance to help communities recover. And one of the things we've recently done is, for years, you had to build back similar to what you had. And so we've really addressed codes and standards, and I want to thank the congressional delegation here in Louisiana that gave some legislation for us to be able to look at, when we're rebuilding, how do we build better with new codes and standards? And we fund that in the grant dollars that we give to entities that are rebuilding to make them more resilient for future events. All right, the declaration process, a lot of people ask us about this. There are many disasters that happen every day in this country that don't get FEMA's assistance. So I want to make it really clear. Your local emergency managers, your local first responders are true heroes. They do work every day that never rises to the level where FEMA gets involved. We have a lot of training programs in our preparedness space that we're trying to work with them to make sure that they have the tools and resources to do their jobs, but they take care of a lot of local disasters on their own. When an incident rises above a local capability to respond, the locals go to the governor, and the governor then can have resources, whether it be the National Guard, state agency resources that they can respond to. When it rises above what the governor feels is within the state's capability, then he can make a request through the regional office to the president for federal assistance. And so that's how we get involved. We can't just deploy on our own. We need that request from the governor to be able to, once again, Constitution has state sovereignty for us to be able to come in and be able to provide that assistance. Now, with that said, when we see a hurricane coming, we don't wait for the governor to make a disaster request of us. We will start moving commodities and start positioning people in advance to where we think a hurricane may make landfall or where the state may need us, because we don't want to be late to need. Once we get that governor's request, we want to be moving. So in what we call blue sky days like today, we're out assessing facilities, whether they be old military bases, FedEx facilities, UPS facilities, where we can bring commodities in and store them in a disaster. So we're looking at those things every day, so we know what's the maximum we can put in an area to pre-stage for an event. And we're doing that in conjunction with the state, so we know where they maybe have staging bases, where they may put stuff further in during a disaster. We're also doing that with our medical teams and others, and we practice that pretty regularly here in the state of Louisiana. We just did what we call a rehearsal concept drill last month to be prepared for hurricane season. But for a disaster declaration where we turn on those programs that help individuals and you can register for FEMA assistance, that does take a request from the governor. And there are some certain pieces of information. Typically it's a threat from a hurricane or something that we clearly know from the Weather Service or others that's going to cause impacts, or this event has happened and we do damage assessments that reach a certain threshold. The other thing there's a lot of confusion about is the governor, under his authority, can declare a state emergency. And that's really part of the state's emergency plan that's authorized by the legislature that they have to turn on in order to be able to use state resources, waive some of the contracting. And so people get confused about that. They say, oh, there was a declaration. It could be a state declaration and not the federal declaration. So that's something we see a lot of confusion, not only here in Louisiana, but across the country. And just know that that's the first step in the process then to ask for federal assistance. Our recovery programs, I already talked a little bit about those. The individual assistance program, that's providing assistance primarily through grants to individuals. We can provide housing. Many of you all have seen direct housing is in the form of usually a manufactured housing unit. It's a temporary housing measure, not meant to be permanent. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is a partner of ours, and they get involved in the longer-term rebuilding and housing, and they have some grant programs in addition to the normal programs that come in after a disaster. Public assistance is what we provide to local, state, non-governmental organizations that provide a governmental service to be able to help them recover from disasters financially. Both those programs have a 75% federal and then 25% cost share that's non-federal. So either the locals or the state will have to pick up that cost share unless the president does a waiver to adjust that cost share. And then finally, we have a hazard mitigation grant program. That provides funding after a disaster that can help communities build back stronger. What we saw a lot after Ida was hardening pump stations, maybe increasing the size of drainage to be able to make sure that flooding doesn't occur and alleviate flooding. All right, I'm going to quickly go through a couple of things, and then I'll stop and kind of give you a chance to ask some questions. But I did want to talk quickly about individual assistance and some of the things that we've learned here in Louisiana, especially after Hurricanes Laura and Delta. And so for this program, it used to be required that you had to have a fully executed deed in order to get assistance. And what we found, not only here in Louisiana, but in the South, is in some property owners who's been handed down from generation to generation, the arid property, the deed's really hard to come by. And it really stopped their assistance because they would have applied, and some of you may have heard that I got denied for FEMA. Well, they weren't denied, but we were waiting on that deed in order to make sure we were providing money to the proper homeowner to be able to provide that assistance. And in some cases, once again, with a fully executed deed, that took months if they could ever provide that documentation. And so after Hurricanes Laura and Delta, we got the rules changed to where we can accept a utility bill, we can accept things that are common. You see a tax bill, even certification from the mayor or local official to be able to say that we know Tony Robinson lives at 123 First Street and be able to process that for assistance. So that was huge. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but in Ida it was about 90,000 people that this helped serve. And so we've learned a lot. The other thing that just occurred in March of this year is when you applied for FEMA assistance as an individual, you got some assistance, and then you were provided information to apply for a small business administration loan. Well, most people saw that and said, I'm not a small business, so I throw this thing in the trash and see what happens next. Well, that stopped their process. And so it was very confusing to people was, why am I, as an individual, getting this small business administration loan packet? That was part of the congressional intent to say if they were capable of paying a loan, that would be a form of assistance that we'd want them to get so that it wouldn't be a burden on the taxpayers who weren't impacted by disasters. This year we have decoupled the SBA process, the Small Business Administration process, from that declaration process. So we've streamlined the application process to really now ask questions to get to what's the need of the individual who's applying and what's the right financial assistance that we can provide to them to be able to help them on the road to recovery. Knowing that still the intent is not to make them whole, nothing will replace insurance, but we want to be able to help them on the road to recovery. So get some money in their pocket. If they left their house with just the clothing on their back, we've got a serious needs assistance that could give them $750 to go get baby food, go get diapers, go get formula, things that we see over and over again in disasters. And so we've really streamlined this process trying to help. Now, I don't want anybody to leave here today thinking the Small Business Administration is not still a great partner. They are, and they will be involved in helping people get loans because it's a much greater amount. They can give over $250,000 to individuals that qualify, and they also have a great business program to be able to help businesses get low-interest loans to get back on their feet as well. So what we've just done is tried to eliminate that confusion by things that we've learned here in Louisiana after many of the large disasters that we faced. So here's some of those new things. We've established some new benefits, the serious needs assistance. We also knew that when we provide housing assistance for people to provide rent, if we do that too early in the first 2 or 3 days, they're going to buy their basic needs with that money. And then if they need 60 days later additional rental assistance, we have to ask them, where's your lease? How did you spend that money? And they said, well, I went and bought groceries. I went and bought something other than rent, and so that stops the process. And so we've got now some assistance that says this is some money that can help them with their immediate needs, and then we'll phase in the rental assistance when they say, I've got a place, I'm ready for that rental assistance, so we alleviate that issue from occurring where it stops them from getting additional rental assistance. Our programs are typically meant for 18 months, so our direct housing, our rental assistance, but we do have the ability based on the scope and scale of the disaster to extend some of that financial assistance. We've cut the red tape on eligibility, really looking at not making you answer every question that was in our toolbox, but to try and look at, by answering certain questions early on that tell us about the scale and scope of your disaster, what type of assistance that you may need as well. And so Louisiana was a huge help in helping us be able to resolve and basically streamline a lot of this processes just because of the number of disasters you've heard from people like Mike who have given us feedback throughout the year. Mike serves on our Regional Advisory Council, so that, once again, every day we're looking for them to provide us how do we get better at serving the people of Louisiana, knowing that we have to do it within the rules, regulations, and authorities in which we have. Public assistance, I'll just quickly lay out. We do that in categories, so you may hear about categories of debris or categories of assistance. And really what we're trying to do there is in the early days, we know emergency protective measures, that's what locals do to protect life and property. That's your police, your fire overtime, barricading roads, emergency operations centers, and then picking up the debris. A community doesn't recover unless the debris gets picked up to allow access from roadways, but also off your property so you can start the rebuild process. And then the other forms we call permanent work, we're out doing work for roads, bridges. That's the work that takes a little bit longer because we're looking for engineering work there and how to design roads that maybe will hold up and perform better, how you look at water facilities that will be more resilient in the future. And so that's the permanent work that we provide reimbursement once some of the repairs are done. All right. I'm going to just, last thing is 2017, we did come out with some regulations that helped with assistance to House of Worship. We know a lot of our House of Worship do schools and other things that are really key and critical to communities and their ability to thrive. And so that was limited assistance before 2017, but now if they provide eligible assistance, we can provide financial assistance just like we can to a local government for our houses of worship. All right, I'm going to pause there. See if anybody, I know I rapid fired you real quick, but any questions?
Thank you. And thank you for coming on a blue sky day. Okay? Because in the midst of disaster, that whole process with individuals and small business, that made no sense even in the best of times. And I know it has a lot of work to change something that supposedly has been working. But I know many of us have worked with people like Katrina. And thank you, Mike, for what you've done to help communicate and to bring change. I'm just stunned that this makes so much more sense. So I want to thank you, and I want to encourage you to keep going to the areas that are hit by disaster. Because so many of us are still kind of working under the way it used to be, right, believing it can't be changed. It's too big of a system. And in the midst of a disaster, you feel so alone. And so thank you for hearing us, and hopefully we can communicate this to others. So thank you.
Thank you for that, and certainly for the Rotary Club here is, if you want to get your information through Mike, this is the best way we get that feedback. That's why we made some of our regulation changes, because we heard from people in the communities that said these things are inhibitors for us recovering, and so we had to make change. And I really, our Administrator, Dan Criswell, has really pushed hard. We've got some pending legislation in the Disaster Survivor Fairness Act that will also give us some additional authorities that if we can get that passed, will make the housing and other things, we think, a little bit more, move a little bit quicker, which is really something I think we've heard loud and clear.
How big a problem is fraud, and do you have any data on the extent of it in Louisiana?
So I don't know that I have the exact statistics, and it's a great question because we were just in Lake Charles with the Emergency Management Association here in Louisiana, and the Insurance Commissioner's Office was talking about things they're doing to combat insurance fraud. In our program, we have a lot of safeguards built in the registration process. So we use some national industry standards to be able to make sure that whoever's telling us who they are is registered, so that we match that up against other records that says Tony Robinson is the person that's in national recognized databases, the person who lives at 123 First Street. And then we also have systems that check, because obviously in today's technology world, there's a lot of bots out there. Some of the assistance that puts money in the hands of people very quickly. That's a great thing for the people, but there are also nefarious actors that try and take advantage of that. And so our systems are regularly checking to saying, wait a minute, we have 3 123 First Streets now in the system. We will pause applications, and so that's good because it's detecting fraud, but then it may pause an applicant's recovery process, because we're going to spend some time checking that to make sure the money that we do give goes to the right individual. In addition to that, we have an independent body, the Office of Inspector General, that also does oversight for our agency and make sure that we have proper fraud controls in place. Are some going to slip through? Absolutely, but I think the last number I heard was 2-3%. I think was what the number that we got from our national office. But that's a great question and something that we're very concerned about. We obviously want to get money out quickly, but we also have a fiduciary responsibility to the American taxpayer.
Is the 2-3% though the same for Louisiana?
I'd have to check. I could work with Mike and get you that number back. That's probably more of a nationwide standard.
Hey, Tony, Ryan Williams, Wings of the Spirit. We are a faith-based disaster relief organization. We actually have teams deployed to Sulphur now.
Thanks.
One of the questions that I have is what, and maybe this will work for anybody who is of a house of faith or another nonprofit. How do we engage in conversation with FEMA? We've been through some local ads and some things like that. Can you explain how we engage that dialogue?
Yeah, so a couple ways. First is DHS has an Office of Faith-Based and Community Services. Marcus Coleman is the leader of that. He works with us regularly. He sits in our FEMA headquarters office, and so we always look for opportunities to engage the faith-based organizations. We had some meetings after IDA to sit down and talk about the assistance process, and so if you'll get us your contact information, we'll work. We work very closely with the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, but we're willing to come out and talk about preparedness activity, but also talk about things that House of Worship can do to navigate the recovery process and the grant process. And so anybody who's out there, the two things that we see as the most significant thing for people who apply for the public assistance process is there is a bid process requirement in the federal government that's somewhat unique, not necessarily the same as maybe they have at the local or state level. And so we want to make sure that people go through the right bid process, and then documentation of what was damage, number one, and what you did to recover your expenses so that we have good documentation. Those are the two things that really, in audits and our fraud detection, are the things that kind of slow down that recovery process. But be more than happy to sit down with groups. Marcus Coleman and his group are out there doing meetings pretty regularly. We're trying to right now schedule a Gulf Coast. So we know Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, when there's a storm, that cone of air is probably going to go from Florida to Texas, and we want to bring those faith-based organizations together.
Yeah, we find they're reactionary more than proactive.
Yes.
Yeah, and so volunteer housing is a huge need. We've been focusing on trying to deploy volunteer housing to ground zero relatively quickly to be able to get those faith-based organizations in and serving up and running and doing some of those kind of first responder things prior to you guys showing up. So working with, not against, and trying to figure out how to not duplicate services is something that I see everybody's tripping over each other because of the lack of communication. So
Yep.
it's something I love to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, the faith-based volunteer organizations, there is a volunteer organizations active in disasters. It's a national structure, but Louisiana also has a VOAD group, so does Texas, that's focused on the state level to kind of help increase that communication and coordination. So certainly would like to connect up with them as well to see if there's anything we can do to help.
Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. Tony, thank you so much for being here. I'm Erin Forche, and I wanted to hear more about, in the vein of resilience, and the impacts of small businesses recovering and having contingency plans and continuity plans. Can you share information about resources that trickle down from the federal level to the state level to support small businesses to recover after being impacted by disasters, considering that small businesses really fuel our economy? I'd love to hear more about what's in place there or in play for resilience. Thank you.
Yes, great question. Obviously, the business community is key to getting a community's recovery back up in operation after disaster. Certainly, we think the tornadoes in Sulphur are going to be a big challenge. And so at FEMA, we have an interagency recovery coordination team that really gets out into the community early. They've already been in Sulphur. They're doing an assessment that says what are the federal programs that can potentially help them. So the Department of Commerce, Economic Development Administration has programs that can be able to potentially help. One of the things is to provide a planner for that local community to say, how do you work with that business community to help plan what their recovery looks like, because most communities don't really have that type of resource in their communities. And then what kind of grants are available from the federal government to be able to help. So that group goes out early on, identifies those things, and then works with the local community on how do you apply for that, how do you get those types of grants in the community. The other thing that I would say to you is if you're a business in this room and you haven't talked about what is your emergency response plan, how do you communicate with your employees? What do you do when your facility is impacted? In that same tornado that impacted Sulphur, there was a Dollar Tree warehouse that if you came from the street, you can see a little bit of damage, but if you fly overhead, the whole roof's peeled off, and their container boxes are just laying on top of one another, the tractor trailers. Some even were thrown across the street. And so it's very important, what do they do with their workforce? Because if they can't go to work, they're going to go somewhere else. I mean, they need to feed their families. So how do they, what's their plan? Do they put them in different distribution centers? And so those are things that from your business plan, your business continuity plan, we really encourage people to be able to, we've got some resources on our ready.gov website, but have a plan to know how you're going to communicate with your workforce. Really important post-disaster, what happens? What's their livelihood? Are they going to get a paycheck? Is there a plan to pay them for 2 weeks or a week? Do you have your insurance set up to be able to take care of those kind of things? And so from a business continuity perspective, that planning up front, knowing what you're going to do, working with your local emergency managers, because you may be a resource to them also in an event if you're not damaged. And so those things are really important.
Last question. We have both, with Alzheimer's Services, we have both an internal emergency preparedness plan,
Great.
but we also produce one for families with Alzheimer's. And my question is, on your website, do you have some concise, short information that we might include in the emergency manual for how to file or how to get assistance immediately?
So we do. We also have a FEMA app that tells you what resources are available. So when there's a disaster, it'll pull up and tell you where recovery centers are. It'll give you some preparedness tips. But what I'd ask you and all of you is go on our ready.gov website, take a look at that information, and if there's things on there that you say this could be better written, or this didn't address what I really needed to address, that information is vitally important to us. We've been working with some academia to kind of help us on messaging. I know the Weather Service has looked as well. How many watch, warning, that may make sense to a meteorologist, but for a lot of the public, it can be a little bit confusing. And so looking at how we can address our warning messages and our public-facing documentation to be able to help people. So there are some ready.gov or listo.gov or some resources, a FEMA app that you can download on an Apple or Android device, which also gives you preparedness tips, in a disaster to tell you where shelters are, to tell you where recovery centers are, and so I'd encourage you to download those information as well. You can be a help to us. You're part of the team. We're all in this together when the disaster happens. So give us that information before an event. That's very helpful for us to do better in our preparedness messaging, but then take that information. One of the things I would also encourage you, if you or your family has school-age children, work with that school. Mother Nature's not going to work with us in the most convenient manner, and so we've seen many events happen when kids are at school, and how panicking is that, is knowing, is my kid safe? Where do I go to pick them up? And so certainly would encourage you to work with your school on their preparedness planning and make sure you know what to do if the event happens when you and your child are separated. Thank you all very much for having me.
Thank you so much.